The Ghost in the Mirror by John Bellairs, Chapter 3. With the Plymouth's hood embedded in the snowbank, the engine sputtered and died, and for a few seconds all was silent. At a loss for words, Rosarita looked around again at a landscape that was unquestionably pretty, but that was completely out of place. The day was hazy, bright. The sun shone wanly through a high icy layer of cloud, and the light reflected off icicles and the drifts of snow. Then Mrs. Zimmerman said briskly, "Well, I certainly didn't expect this. I only hope my poor car has survived the shock of going tobogganing." Rosarita stared at her friend in wonder. Didn't Mrs. Zimmerman see what a mess they were in? Already the air inside the car felt chilly. The modern paved highway they had been driving on had vanished, and in its place was a country lane, narrow and unpaved and coated with ice. Yet Mrs. Zimmerman made a joke of their accident. She sounded unconcerned, as if they had only taken a wrong turn or if the car had blown a tire. Maybe Mrs. Zimmerman had really gone out of her mind. Rosarita felt frightened, but she wasn't the sort of person who usually panicked. For some reason, Mrs. Zimmerman's little jest really irritated her. She cried out, "Mrs. Zimmerman, this is weird. It's scary. Not some kind of a funny story. Get us out of here." After one startled glance, Mrs. Zimmerman gave her a friendly pat on the shoulder and a reassuring smile, although it looked forced and strained. "Come on, Rosarita. You've seen me fool around with magic enough to take in stride something as minor as an unscheduled change of weather. I'll admit that finding a tunnel into the middle of winter isn't an ordinary everyday occurrence, but then neither is this an ordinary everyday trip. We're out looking for magic. Let me set Bessie to rights, and then I'll explain what I think has happened to us." She carefully started the Plymouth's engine and then eased the car into reverse. As the engine raced, the wheels spun with a high whirring noise, and the car rocked back and forth, but the hood did not budge from the snowbank. Said Mrs. Zimmerman. "We need more traction. Let's see what we can do." They got out of the car. Mrs. Zimmerman stooped low to look at the rear wheels. Then she pointed to the side of the road where piles of dead tree branches lay in a tangle under the shelter of the roadside firs. "Let's get some of those and shove them under the rear tires. I once saw Jonathan get his antique car out of a similar predicament this way." Already Rosarita was shivering, and her teeth chattered from the cold. But being active helped her warm up a little. She trotted back and forth, helping Mrs. Zimmerman drag 24 small branches across the road. Then they jammed the branches under the rear tires. Mrs. Zimmerman nodded and said, "That ought to do it. Let's try again now." The car felt warm after the icy chill outside. Mrs. Zimmerman started the engine and again put the car into reverse. But this time she was careful to apply the gas gradually. Bessie slowly began to move, crunching over the dead wood with a loud crackling sound. Once the car had moved over the branches, it hesitated for a moment. Rosarita caught her breath. She was afraid the car would slip back down the hill. Then the rear tires got a better grip on the icy surface and pulled them back onto the lane as a few clumps of snow fell from the fenders, front bumper, and grille. "Very good," Mrs. Zimmerman said, sounding relieved. "Now we have to get to the bottom of the hill in one piece, and I think we'll turn on the heater, too." The path in front of them led downward, not very steeply, but it wound as it descended the hill. The Plymouth edged forward slowly, and they passed the flattened black tree branches and the gouge in the snowbank that the hood had made. The engine was already warm, and the heater began to blow toasty air against their legs. With a little sigh of contentment, Mrs. Zimmerman said, "There. Now let's see if we can get to civilization, and once we're safe, I'll tell you where and when we are." "When we are?" Rosarita asked. The phrase did not exactly throw her, because she had read about time travel before in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. She immediately grasped what Mrs. Zimmerman was implying, though she could not believe it. "You mean we're in a different year? Do you think this is 1951? Mrs. Zimmerman said tensely as she tried to guide the automobile down the icy hillside. She had a little frown of concentration on her face, and her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The Plymouth had picked up speed. Then all at once it began to swerve in an unpleasant way. As the tires slipped, Mrs. Zimmerman spun the wheel first one way and then the other, and then she said, "Whoops, hold on!" The car had gone into a downhill skid. Bessie slipped right off the left side of the lane with a tooth-rattling bounce and kept going. It felt like a ride on the Alpine Adventure, the roller coaster that came to the New Zebedee athletic fields when the Camperdown County Agricultural Fair every fall. Rosarita didn't quite close her eyes as the car plowed into a dense, snow-heaped clump of rhododendron with a scrape of branches on metal. Abruptly, they plunged from thin, wintry sunlight into spooky, silent darkness as the car skidded into the very center of the thicket. For a second time, the engine coughed, clattered, and died. "Well," Mrs. Zimmerman said, "that's it as far as I'm concerned. Driving on ice is far from my favorite thing to do, and since I don't have any chains in the trunk, I suppose we'll have to wait until the ice thaws." "Wait? Here?" Roswitha asked. "We'll freeze to death." Mrs. Zimmerman clicked her tongue. "No, we certainly can't wait in the car for someone to rescue us. I doubt that anyone could even see us from the road, but we're fairly close to the town of Snowbridge, unless we've moved in space as well as time. I don't think we have, because this scenery looks very familiar. From our surroundings, I would say we must be in, about 1898 or 1900 or so." Roswitha could not help feeling distraught. "I don't know what you're talking about, or how you got that time travel idea. All I can see is that we left summer and now it's winter. And the car is stuck and we don't have any way out and it's getting cold." "Good heavens, Roswitha." Mrs. Zimmerman reflected that Roswitha really had a legitimate complaint. After all, though, she had warned Roswitha that the trip might involve danger. She had not specified what type of danger to expect. And even though Roswitha did have some reason to anticipate something odd going from summer into winter did call for some explanation. "Listen, I'll tell you what I think has happened," Mrs. Zimmerman said. "I believe the ghost of Granny Weatherby has taken us back to the time and place where I first met her. Let me see. My older sister Anna married Harold Crimpin in June of 1898, and they moved to Stonebridge, Pennsylvania, where he began his law practice. I visited them that first summer. That was when I met Granny Weatherby. She was about 80, and I was almost 12. After that, I often visited my sister and brother-in-law, and during my visits to Stonebridge, Granny Weatherby taught me about magic." Roswitha understood. "So that's where we are now, near your sister's house?" Mrs. Zimmerman nodded. "Yes, in 1951, the highway we were on goes through the tunnel, turns south, and runs right through the center of the town. In 1898, it was the Mount Kidron Road. That was an old dirt road which ended on the graveled highway leading into Stonebridge. Unless I'm mistaken, we're on Fuller's Hill. I ought to recognize it because this is where Otto Pennybaker used to take me sledding. Otto was sort of my first boyfriend, but not really. The two of us were a lot like you and Louis, I suppose." Roswitha blushed. "Louis is just a boy who happens to be my friend," she said. "He's not my boyfriend. He wouldn't even dance with me." Mrs. Zimmerman waited, but Roswitha did not say anything more about Louis. "I thought you two were having some kind of problem before Jonathan whisked him away on the European jaunt," she said. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No," Roswitha said. "I want to know why you think we're in 1898 and not 1951. Heavens, but you're certainly crabby today. Well, as I was telling you, the reason is simply that it looks like 1898 and not like 1951. I haven't been to Stonebridge in years because my sister died in 1939. Still, even back then, the tunnel led through the mountain, and this was a paved road instead of just a wagon track. Now, however, it looks just the way I remember it looking when I was 12. With a smile, Mrs. Zimmerman went on. "Anyway, if this is really the Mount Kidron Road, we must be about 4 miles from Stonebridge. It won't be a very comfortable walk in this weather, but I think we can make it, and there ought to be some traffic on the Stonebridge Road, even if it is the middle of winter." Roswitha's head whirled. "But if we're in 1898, I haven't been born yet," she said. She did a little subtraction in her head. "And I won't be born for another 39 years. How can I exist before I was even born?" "There are some questions I can't answer. As for going back in time, it obviously doesn't affect you physically. I mean, I don't look as if I've gone back to being 12 years old, do I?" Mrs. Zimmerman replied. "Look, Roswitha, I'm not exactly sure how the magic has worked, and I'm not even sure what I'm supposed to do next, but Granny Weatherby's ghost told me that to get my powers back, I would have to go back to the beginning place. Those were her very words. 'Flory, you must return to the beginning place. You must set right the great wrong.' Now, exactly what she meant, I can't tell you. She certainly didn't say anything about any great wrong the first time I met her, although she had had an unhappy life. Anyway, we won't find out anything by sitting in the car. You didn't pack any kind of coat, did you?" Roswitha shook her head. "No, only jeans and shirts and a couple of sweatshirts." Mrs. Zimmerman thought for a moment. "Well, That's really pretty good. I have my raincoat and my robe and pajamas. We ought to manage to survive the cold if we each put on several layers of clothes. The car had made a sort of tunnel into the rhododendron thicket, and branches jammed Rosarita's door shut, so both of them had to struggle out the driver's door. The disturbed limbs overhead showered down freezing snow and somehow managed to find its way right down their collars. Although the day was bright with the hazy sun, the outside air was bitter, stinging Rosarita's nose, and beneath the rhododendrons very little sun leaked through. They had no way of judging the temperature, but Rosarita thought it must be below zero. Fortunately, no wind was blowing. Mrs. Zimmerman opened the trunk, and they began to unpack clothes. Hurrying because of the cold, Rosarita put on 3 pairs of jeans, although the last pair had to stay unfastened. She also wore 2 shirts and 2 sweatshirts. She had been wearing a pair of brown penny loafers, but at Mrs. Zimmerman's suggestion, she took these off and replaced them with her PF Flyer sneakers. Since they were nearly new, the treads on the bottoms would give her better traction for walking on ice. She wore 2 pairs of socks, so the tennis shoes were a tight fit. Finally, as she was about to close her valise, she remembered something she had packed just on a whim. She rummaged until she found it and took it out. It was her old black plush beanie, decorated with buttons of Kellogg's cereal cartoon characters. She had not worn it in nearly 2 years. Now, however, she jammed it onto her head, grateful for its added warmth. Mrs. Zimmerman bundled up similarly, putting on 3 purple dresses and her purple floral bathrobe, and topping off her outfit with her purple raincoat. Although she had packed no sneakers, her regular shoes were good, sensible footwear for walking, and she borrowed a couple of pairs of socks from Rosarita to help keep her feet warm. At one of the stops they had made, Mrs. Zimmerman had bought a souvenir towel decorated with a print of the Toledo City skyline at sunset. She tied the towel around her head as if it were a scarf. She was an odd sight when she had finished, because normally she was quite thin, a slim, upright woman with an untidy mop of frizzy gray hair. With the layers of clothing she now wore, she looked as if she had gained 30 pounds, and Rosarita had to giggle a little. Mrs. Zimmerman grinned and stuck out her tongue. "You won't win any fashion prizes either," she said, "but at least we won't freeze solid. All set? Let's see if we can cover some ground." She slammed the trunk shut with a crash that shook the miniature avalanche off the rhododendron leaves overhead. They had to help each other over the slippery spots, but both of them were good walkers. Even with Rosarita limping, they moved along at a fairly fast clip. Rosarita's beanie helped keep her head warm, and her long hair covered her ears and provided some protection from the frigid air. Mrs. Zimmerman's nose and cheeks soon began to glow a bright red from the cold. And before long, both of them were huffing out clouds of vapor, their lungs heaving from exertion. After 5 minutes of slippery walking, they came to the bottom of the hill. There was a slightly larger road joined the lane they were on. Mrs. Zimmerman paused here with her hands on her hips. "Now that's strange," she said. "This must be Fuller's Hill. And I distinctly remember—" "Oh, never mind." Rosarita did mind. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed again. "What's wrong now?" Mrs. Zimmerman shrugged. "It's probably nothing but my memory playing tricks on me. This should be the Stonebridge Road, but I remember it as being wider and graveled. And there also was a little country store here where the roads came together. At least I think there was. Of course, all this was more than 50 years ago, so I may just be wrong. Well, we'll soon know. Stonebridge is this way." They turned south onto the new road, which appeared to be more heavily traveled than the road from Fuller's Hill. At least the surface lay rutted down in frozen earth, without a slick, slippery coating of ice. However, although the footing was better, the day was still icy and raw, and Rosarita became increasingly uncomfortable. Her weak ankle throbbed painfully. Her nose began to run and her chest ached from the cold air. Rosarita was rarely sick, but regularly once every winter she came down with the sniffles, usually just after the first really cold spell. Now, as they walked along the road, she had the miserable feeling that she was going to get a cold. Suddenly, Mrs. Zimmerman stopped ahead of her, and Rosarita almost ran into her. "What is it?" "Listen," Mrs. Zimmerman said, holding out one hand for silence. From the distance came a faint jingling, creaking, clopping sound, like a horse and wagon. Rosarita recognized the sound because her uncle drove a wagon pulled by a team of mules on his farm outside New Zebedee, and she often rode around the farm in the wagon, sometimes even holding the reins. Mrs. Zimmerman turned. "It's coming from that way." The two travelers paused, looking back along the road, which made a gentle sweeping curve around the foot of Fuller's Hill, and sure enough, after a moment, a handsome chestnut-colored horse came into view, stepping high. He was pulling a small green cart that held a man and child, both of them heavily bundled. The man gave Mrs. Zimmerman and Rose Rita a long look, and as the cart came up to them, he reined in the horse. "Whoa, Nicholas," he said in a deep voice. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" He had a lilting German accent, like Pastor Bunsen at the Grace Lutheran Church back in New Zebedee. The man wore a wide-brimmed black hat, and as he lifted it, he revealed a broad red face, bright blue eyes, and an abundance of golden curls, just touched with a few streaks of gray. He looked like a man of good humor and goodwill. "I am afraid we are," said Mrs. Zimmerman said. "Tell me, is this the road to Stonebridge?" The man formed the word silently with his lips. Then he said it aloud. "Stonebridge. Stonebridge. If you mean Steinbrook, yeah. The village is just 3 miles ahead, but no one calls it Stonebridge." He put his hat back on. The child beside him had been sitting huddled up, her features concealed by a bonnet and a heavy blanket that wrapped around her shoulders. Now she raised her head. Rosrita saw that it was a blonde little girl a year or two younger than she was, with a plump round face and wide eyes with irises so dark blue they looked black. Beside Rosrita, Mrs. Zimmerman stiffened. "My God," she said under her breath in a louder voice that shook just a little. She repeated to the man, "I'm afraid that we are in trouble. We lost our carriage and our way. We need your help, if you don't mind." "Mind? Of course not. I will be glad to help you in any way. Look, we are much closer to my farm than to Steinbrook, and it is a very cold day. You get into the cart, and I will take you to the farm. My wife and I will give you a good hot meal and beds for the night. In the morning we will see what we can do to help you." "It's very kind of you to take the trouble," Mrs. Zimmerman said, already climbing into the cart. "Oh, it is no trouble. Let me give you a hand up, young fellow," the man said to Rosrita. She realized with embarrassment that he thought she was a boy, probably because of the jeans she wore and the way all those clothes padded her out. She grabbed the man's gloved hand, put one foot on the little metal step, then scrambled up and got into the cart behind the girl, who turned and gave her a sly smile. Mrs. Zimmerman sat on the hard bench beside Rosrita, staring intently at the child. Their rescuer shook the reins and clicked his tongue, and Nicholas, the horse, began to pace along again, his hoofs drumming on the frozen road. At last Mrs. Zimmerman stirred. "We haven't introduced ourselves. I'm Mrs. Florence Zimmerman, and this young fellow is Rose Rita Pottinger. She is my grandniece." The man turned and gave Rose Rita a closer look. "Well, you don't say. So he is a she, eh? I am sorry for the mistake, Miss Rose Rita. My name is Herman Weiss, and this lady beside me is my daughter Hilda. You will find a spare blanket folded beneath the seat. Wrap yourself in it if you are cold." For a second time, Rosrita felt Mrs. Zimmerman start. Rosrita was very cold, so she pulled the blanket out and gave one end to Mrs. Zimmerman as if she were in a trance. Mrs. Zimmerman numbly took the blanket and wrapped it around herself. Rosrita draped the other end around her own shoulders and snuggled close, grateful for the warmth the blanket gave her stiff fingers. She wondered why Mrs. Zimmerman was acting so strangely, and why she stared so hard at the little girl on the seat ahead of them. In fact, Rosrita was burning with questions, but she sensed it would be unwise to ask them in the presence of Mr. Weiss and his daughter. With a sigh that puffed away in a wisp of steamy mist, she realized she would just have to wait. The truth was that Mrs. Zimmerman had experienced 2 strong shocks. The first one happened the moment she saw Hilda Weiss, because she immediately recognized the little girl's features. She had seen Hilda's face before. It had been one of the mysterious visions that had flickered across the wall of the passageway outside the pantry. This was the sad little beckoning girl whom she remembered seeing in her own home, and it was possible, though Mrs. Zimmerman was not certain, that Mr. Weiss was one of the laughing people she had seen at another time in the same place. There remained the desolate cemetery at night, but Mrs. Zimmerman was in no hurry to see that vision in real life. The second shock came when Mrs. Zimmerman heard the girl's name. Granny Weatherby's full name had been Mrs. Hilda Weiss Weatherby. The 82-year-old woman Mrs. Zimmerman had once known and this 12-year-old girl were one and the same. That explained why there was no country store at the foot of Fuller's Hill. Mrs. Zimmerman and Rose Rita were not in 1898 after all. They had to be in a much, much earlier time, and maybe they were stuck there. And that is the end of Chapter 3.